All right. Well, hello and good evening to you. It's Michael Murphy here, and I hope you can hear me. A blessed feast day of the seven holy founders of the Servite Order to you all. That's an older order, early, late Middle Ages, early Renaissance order, but today's their feast day, and so we join in celebration on their feast. I want to welcome you to our annual St. John Henry Newman Lecture featuring Dr. Jennifer Newsome Martin of the University of Notre Dame. My name is Michael Murphy, and I direct the Hank Center here at Loyola, Chicago. And on behalf of our university leadership, and on behalf of the Hank family, whose generous gift motors and generates and moves our every enterprise, I extend a heartfelt greeting to all. A kind welcome also from our dedicated center staff, Office Manager Patty Delgado, and our student interns, Adam and Grace. This year's Newman Lecture is called The Sacrament of the Possible, or Why I Became a Catholic. And I'm really looking forward to settling in and listening to it. Jenny is such a gifted thinker and speaker, and I'm sure you'll agree, or you already do if you've already heard her speak. She's really gifted. So thanks, Jenny. The St. John Henry Newman Lecture Series is named after the great 19th century English prelate who wrote very movingly about his intellectual journey toward Roman Catholicism in his spiritual autobiography, Apologia Pro Vita Sua from 1864. Newman's work helped later generations of Catholics and Catholic converts map out ways to understand the intellectual elements and other stakes at play in religious faith, especially in light of contemporary issues and challenges that we live through dramatically in modern life, in our journey. It's fair to say that Newman's move to Roman Catholicism, focused as it was about the arguments that attend, and the intellectual commitment required for an authentic life of faith, initiated a 120 or so year trend of the so-called intellectual conversions that followed. So many converts to Catholicism from the late 19th century to the early and mid to late even 20th century came to the church as if from mind to mind. Of course, I don't want to be reductive here, as Catholicism is quite literally a holistic mystery of which the intellectual life is but one component. But it is striking to note how many deep thinkers in Europe and North America, but also many other global places, crossed the Tiber into Rome. Converts were convinced that theism was a better argument than atheism, that Christianity was the most convincing form of theism, and that Catholicism had the most persuasive of Christianity in it, not least because of its robust intellectual social teaching tradition. Thinkers as disparate as Orestes Brownson and Robert Hugh Benson, Edith Stein and Xu Xulin, Gabrielle Marcel, Shusako Endo, and Dorothy Day, these are the converts we see. So honoring this engagement with the Catholic tradition, the Hank Center invites scholars each spring to recount, well, it's not really spring, is it? Jenny, what do you got? 2 feet out there in Notre Dame? Anyway, we invite people in spring to recount their own discovery or rediscovery of the Catholic intellectual tradition in light of their ongoing scholarship. And we have a great one today. And so I'm so happy you accepted our invitation, and it's great to see you again, Jenny, and welcome back to Chicago virtually. But just some housekeeping before we begin. First is to put eyes on our next event, Thursday, February 24th, and our much anticipated visit with Pope Francis. Yeah, you heard that right. Sure, it's on Zoom, but isn't everything, after all? Our event is called Building Bridges North-South. It really is wonderful. A synodal encounter between Pope Francis and university students. It's an event you will not want to miss. It's 12 noon to 1:30, and as always, registration is free. This is really a monumental, historic thing, my friends, and so we expect thousands and thousands of viewers. Please join us. A lot of young people are working very hard in preparing their dialogue with Pope Francis. All right. One note on format, and then we're off. Dr. Martin will speak for about 50 minutes. We'll have then roughly 20 or 25 minutes of audience comment Q&A. Several of our community here online took advantage of writing questions in advance. And so we're going to unmute some people tonight, 2 or 3 folks, to engage Dr. Martin directly. We also encourage audience participation in the usual way, and that is to chat at me, okay? So if you think about a question or a response to Jenny's remarks, type it in the chat and I'll get to as many as I can. I encourage you to listen actively. It's going to be great. So then, here's our lecturer, a brief bio of a really, really full scholarly life in a relatively short time. So I want to welcome Jennifer Newsome Martin, who is a Catholic systematic theologian with research interests in 19th and 20th century Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox thought, theological aesthetics, Trinitarian theology, religion and literature, and ressourcement theology. Her first book, Hans Urs von Balthasar and the Critical Appropriation of Russian Religious Thought, from Notre Dame in 2015, was one of 10 winners of an internationally well-known Manfred Lautenschläger Award. That's the former Templeton Award. That's big. It's a big deal. She also is a co-editor of these great essays in honor of the great Cyril O'Regan, her mentor, and a great man all the way around. That collection is called An Apocalypse of Love, Essays in Honor of Cyril O'Regan, from Herder and Herder about 4 years ago. She's also got work happening in the Blackwell Companion to Catholicism, which is a well-known text, and a TNT monograph series, Explorations at Crossroads of Theology and Aesthetics. So a lot of busy work for Jennifer there, not busy work, but she's keeping busy. Other work has appeared in Modern Theology, the great journal Communio, which is the International Catholic Review, International Journal of Systematic Theology, Newman Studies, that's nice, and a number of edited volumes and collections of essays. Jenny serves on the editorial board of Religion and Literature at Notre Dame and has a history of leadership positions with the Hans Urs von Balthasar consultation of the CTSA and the steering committees for the Christian Systematic Theology Unit and Eastern Orthodox Studies Unit in the American Academy of Religion. Dr. Martin holds a joint appointment in the Program of Liberal Studies, which has great books and core texts, and the Department of Theology at the University of Notre Dame. So without further ado, it's Jennifer Newsome Martin, and the Sacrament of the Possible, or Why I Became a Catholic. Welcome, Dr. Martin. The Zoom stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that really far too kind and generous introduction. I'm really grateful to be here and very honored, and in full disclosure, more than a little bit self-conscious to have been asked to share something of my story of this personal kind of spiritual journey to Catholicism. You all may know that such a thing is not generally the scholar's standard fare. As a group, we're a fairly introverted people and tend to obscure or elide the personal in such rarefied and technical writing that makes it not only difficult to untangle exactly what it is we're saying, but also even to discern with genuine confidence whether or not we are more human or automaton. But with the likes of St. Augustine, servant of God, Dorothy Day, and of course, St. John Henry Newman as my predecessors and guides, my Virgils and my Beatrice, I shall try to summon the courage to speak. Like St. Augustine's Confessions, what is offered here is in the mode of theological memory. It's a recollection, or perhaps more accurately, a recollection, a gathering up and dusting off and laying out of vignettes of personal memories side by side in an effort to discern a rational pattern to those moments, which cumulatively prompted my turn to the Roman Catholic faith at the Easter Vigil of 2005. With St. Augustine too, I must ask what is to me tonight the most urgent question. Lord, my God, judge of my conscience, is my memory correct? This question is pressing because as a genre, both retrospective and constructive, any autobiographical writing is prone to misremembering, to exaggerating, thematizing, fictionalizing, sentimentalizing, disposed either to selective forgetfulness or romance or both. In the 1874 preface to the autobiographical memoir, St. John Henry Newman opines that the genre of, quote, memoir, or at least a life, is more or less the product of the imagination, a conclusion from facts, more or less theoretical and unauthoritative. Besides, for the most part, lives are padded or spun out that they may give an adventitious interest, form a continuous narrative, and complete a volume, end quote. Newman took scrupulous care, however, to preserve testaments to his life in such media as grammar school notebooks, scraps of paper salvaged from his boyhood, and the composition and especially organization of his letters. Letters, he thought, are less susceptible to retrospective fictionalizing. They're confirmed artifacts which don't lie, or which lie less, perhaps, than the stories we tell about ourselves. Letters are facts. And Newman was an archivist of his own facts, a confirmed hoarder of every kind of article that had a personal bearing. He treasured these possessions just because they formed, as it were, an extension of his personality. One piece of ephemera that Newman kept, which I find utterly charming, is what has since been called his autobiography in miniature, written by Newman in a mix of pencil and ink on the back cover of one of his old school exercise notebooks, over the long course of a whopping 72 years, one piece of paper, 72 years, from 1812 to 1884, spanning from age 11 to age 83. Almost an autobiographical prose poem, the document briefly logs significant moments in his life, from a bout of homesickness before he had to take a Greek exam as a young schoolboy, to his monumental conversion to Catholicism, to his being made an Oratorian priest and a cardinal, all with the repetition of a simple phrase, "and now." The preservation of this scrap of ephemera, which survived his many bouts of purging his private journals, powerfully elucidates in one material object themes of the quiet drama of Newman's conversion to holiness and ultimately to the Roman Catholic Church. Quote, "And now," he writes, "in my rooms at Oriel College, a tutor, a parish priest and fellow, having suffered much, slowly advancing to what is good and holy, and led on by God's hand blindly, not knowing whither he is taking me," end quote. In this one artifact, there is both a sense of the passage of time, as well as a sense of a continuous present. Each new entry is extended across time and bridges many years, open to whatever future God would have in store for him as he ages from schoolboy to young adult to midlife to old age. But it is also punctuated by the present, with that continuous repetition of the phrase, "and now." It, along with Newman's journals and letters, represents an artifact, not only of momentous events in his personal and spiritual life, but even more, it is an artifact which witnesses to the loving providence of God. As in the mode of Augustine's Confessions, where the most fundamental confession of the text is not actually of sin, but rather confession and praise of God, Newman suggests that his personal papers provide, quote, "the record of God's great mercies to me, of the wonderful things he has done for my soul," end quote. So when I was asked to give this year's St. John Henry Newman Lecture for the Hanks Center, I went with much trepidation on a quest of my own to recover my own facts and artifacts. Sad to say, I've not been as scrupulous with my record keeping as St. John Henry Newman was, but in the process of my archaeological diggings, I did uncover a thick leather journal from this particularly formative period of my life, over 1,000 bound pages, begun on May 24th, 2000, when I was 20, Protestant, single, and living in the Southern United States, and ended 8 years later in June of 2008, when I was a Catholic, married, a mother, and working on a PhD in systematic theology here at the University of Notre Dame. Less impressive than Newman's 72-year record, I know, but at least it was something. Facts, and not just conclusions from facts. Most of it, of course, was deeply embarrassing, but the indisputable facts were there, some testament to my interior life at the time, but more importantly, to the slow work of God's providence. There's something, I think, about the deliberate act of retrospection, which can illuminate the patterns of a life, where it comes to be seen that what might have looked at the time only like contingent events of personal history were in fact gifts of grace meted out by a watchful hand. I was actually surprised at how many details I'd forgotten along the way. Without their preservation in writing, the providence of God would have been perhaps to me only a theological theorem and not itself an insistent fact. So the title of this evening's talk, The Sacrament of the Possible, is in part a little nod to Jean-Pierre de Caussade's spiritual classic, The Sacrament of the Present Moment, written in the mid-1700s, a book which is customarily subtitled Self-Abandonment to Divine Providence. One surprise, actually, that met me in these pages was that before I revisited them, I would have said, as a reliable kind of shorthand, that my joining the Catholic Church was some species, maybe exclusively a species, of the classic intellectual conversion. And in a way, a real way, I did read my way into the church with books theological, historical, poetic, literary, and hagiographical. I read all the usual suspects: Flannery O'Connor, Walker Percy, Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Gerard Manley Hopkins. I read theology with no awareness of or interest in theological Catholic squabbles. I read Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilson, William Lynch, Edward Schillebeeckx, Karl Rahner, Hans Urs von Balthasar. I recall especially that Robert Louis Wilkins' little book, The Spirit of Early Christian Thought, Seeking the Face of God, was especially formative for making the concerns and figures of early Christianity come alive for me, when even the concept of tradition itself was an unfamiliar one. In retrospect, however, and with the sure testament of my own private record, it turned out that I was not, in fact, fundamentally convinced by scholarly argument, persuasive apologetics, or anyone's dazzling theological acumen, least of all my own, without denying the inherent attraction of the Catholic intellectual heritage, both literary and theological. It was all much more affective, aesthetic, intuitive, and embodied than I remembered. It was, to reference Paul Claudel's guardian angel from the Satin Slipper, the experience of, quote, the fish hook of beauty, that interior sensation in the depth of the self, that space between the heart and the liver, that dull thud, that sharp pull up, that urgent touch, end quote. It was, I think, a bit of a love story. There are entries as early as 2001, 4 years before my eventual conversion in 2005, which witnessed to a strange, visceral, inexplicable pull of and to the beauty of the liturgy. April 15th, 2001 marks, without much context, a longing for a Catholic Mass. And once I began attending Mass regularly as a catechumen 4 years later, I reflected in writing that is the liturgy which draws me in, welcomes me, echoes in my head at all hours. In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. It's so old, ancient, beautiful, tender, and magnificently unsentimental. Rereading entries during the years leading up to my entering into full communion with the Catholic Church was like following a long and golden chain of providential giftedness, being pulled up and further in by the beauty of God. To put an even finer point on the divine sense of humor, I even found stuck within the journal's pages a yellowing index card with some scribbled lines from Plotinus's Aeneid on beauty, a text that describes those who see true beauties as truly enamored, who see the beauty and feel, quote, astonishment and a sweet shock and longing and erotic thrill and a feeling of being overwhelmed with pleasure. Here too, the fundamentally aesthetic character of divine providence emerges. Just as the perceiver of beauty in nature or in art must have the eyes to discern patterns or witness with appreciation the delicate artistic interplay of contingency and freedom, so too the perceiver or reader of a life must do the same. It is, as one commentator on Augustine suggests, to see behind the, quote, seemingly banal experiences of any given life and discern the soul as, quote, a journeying thing, like Israel in the desert, a stranger in a strange land. We all begin as wanderers, estranged from the God of our bliss. But if through growing docility to the welter of admonitions providence scatters along our way, we come first to believe, then to understand the truth of our situation, we may convert our wandering into pilgrimage, into a return to the heavenly Jerusalem from which we have strayed. This realization of the aesthetic character of providence prompted yet another level of appreciation for its mysterious workings. As both my published scholarship and pedagogical interests have to do with forms of theological aesthetics from Plato and Plotinus to Hans Urs von Balthasar, whose dates are 1905 to 1988, and who prioritizes the aesthetic categories of beauty within the discipline of theology, including perception, rapture, encounter, and glory, beauty's theological analog. My present work is animated, at least in part, by themes of beauty and desire, and in structures of Christian revelation, God's personal self-disclosure to human beings, which are fundamentally aesthetic insofar as infinite content is communicated in legible, visible, finite forms in theophany and transfiguration and word and sacrament. Most of my publications in the last decade or so have focused upon the work of Balthasar and certain of his direct theological and literary interlocutors. People like Dante, whose Paradiso is one of the clearest expressions of this primordial call to the divine beauty of God, of Russian Orthodox Vladimir Soloviev, who was the real-life model for Dostoevsky's Alyosha and his The Brothers Karamazov, as well as the French Catholic poet Charles Péguy, who in some ways helped to shape the sensibilities of ressourcement theology in interwar Catholic France and beyond. I've already noted that this title's talk indicates, first in de Caussade's terms, an abandonment to divine providence. But the other primary category at play tonight is that of the possible. As I thought back over the 17 years that I've been a Catholic, and as I reminisce with my husband, who's known me for 24 years and been married to me for almost 20, I was also struck by the fact that my joining the Catholic Church had the character not quite of the dramatic introduction of something new or imputed from without, but rather something like a gradual attunement to possibility. Even though it might seem a little counterintuitive, my own story of becoming a Roman Catholic was experienced in a mode of confirmation, recognition, kinship, and something actually like nostalgia, with a strong sense of coming home to something that I somehow strangely remembered, even as it was in actuality new. The story witnesses to discrete occasions of God's grace that made an imagined, hoped-for possibility concrete and actual. I should say that of all the spiritual paths that lay before me, entering into full communion with the Catholic Church was perhaps the least likely one. In a sense, it seemed to me utterly impossible until it didn't. But the constraints of my upbringing in a large extended family of extremely independent, constitutively temperamental Protestants who were at least unfamiliar with, if not somewhat suspicious of, the tenets of the Catholic faith, contributed to the sense of impossibility of ever becoming a Catholic. This was an outcome that, had someone predicted what was to be, would have been to me utterly beyond belief. Before we get to those decisive years in which it became abundantly clear that I was indeed, however inconceivably, to become a Catholic, it will be helpful to think back even further to an early childhood which served to plant in me the seeds of sympathy for a Catholic sacramental worldview. I often say in jest, though it's not really a joke, that I grew up inside a Flannery O'Connor short story. My earliest childhood memories are set in a tidy little log house in rural North Carolina that my great-grandfather had built in the mid-1800s. Originally, there was one upstairs room and one downstairs room with a fireplace, with additional rooms built around that heart of the structure up through the 1930s. We eventually moved into a larger house that my father built from the ground up, about a quarter of a mile from that historic cabin, and lived there on a 40-acre farm, nestled within tobacco and soybean fields, in what was then an economically fragile town off of Highway 158. We lived very, very far out in the country, in a community populated not by strangers, but by our sprawling extended family of grandmothers and grandfathers, aunts and uncles and cousins. It was not only that we happened to know everyone who lived in our community, like might be the case in any other small Southern town, but in point of fact, we were related to them all. And we shared a name, not only with one another, but with the road itself, alongside all the other Newsomes whose homes and farms were dotted along it. We lived at the very end of one John Newsome Road, just gravel for many years, but eventually paved by the state. Here enacted, before I had the words for it or knew how much of a fragile gift it really was, was a lived theology of local community, a fidelity to place worthy of Wendell Berry's or Peter Marin's call to holy rootedness. If anyone had wanted to visit, they would have had to drive from the one stoplight in the one stoplight town, marked with abandoned houses and storefronts, turn left just past Enterprise Baptist Church onto John Newsome Road. Then once that ran out, turn right onto a dirt road through the woods, past the old tobacco barns and groves of overgrown persimmon trees, past some half-heartedly built tree houses and deer stands, past the wooden outhouse, a relic from generations of Newsome's past, past the simple graves of twin great aunts who had died in the 1930s as infants and were buried there on the property, and finally open out upon a vista with a massive vegetable garden, horse pastures, old barns with chickens and guinea fowl and goats wandering about, a two-story house with a big front porch and a wooden porch swing, and pig pens worthy of Mrs. Turpin's most searing revelatory visions. It was a microcosm of all the lushness and wildness of nature. Wendell Berry's, quote, peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief, end quote. Of thorns, weeds, forests, snakes, unkempt azaleas, and a whole undisciplined, verdant tangle of flora and fauna that my family coaxed into compliance enough to cultivate food from the elements of seed, soil, sunshine, water, and time. This farm and all its unexplored territory, know that 40 acres to a child was a universe, was the site of a particularly southern brand of rural childhood. Now, the rose-colored glasses with which I am very likely re-envisioning the setting recall a particular quality of afternoon light, slanting over landscapes of fields peppered with hay bales or corn, ordinary and heartbreakingly beautiful. To a child, at least to me as a child, who possessed a rather galling spiritual precociousness and bookishness, which included lugging a giant Bible around to read outdoors, it was not just beautiful, it was enchanted. The world, I thought even then, was full of signs. My siblings and I basically lived outdoors, especially in the summers, traipsing through the cold water of the creeks to find crawfish under heavy boulders, skipping highly coveted thin flat rocks at the pond, picking four-leaf clovers out the rabbit pens, standing in the garden with a salt shaker in our pockets, eating warm sun-ripened tomatoes straight from the vine. When my mother wanted us kids home in the evening, she would ring a big, heavy cast iron dinner bell. I remember my father killing the pigs in winter and making fresh sausage at the wooden kitchen table with an old-fashioned grinder clamped to the table. Our water came from a deep well on the property, and it was always cold and utterly delicious. Now, I belabor all these details, not just from an overactive sense of nostalgia, to which I readily admit, but to note how thoroughly connected we were to the land and to the agricultural rhythms of planting, picking, and preserving, an embodied foretaste perhaps of the rhythms of the liturgical seasons, to the constitutive futurity that animates a Christian practice oriented to the eschatological, and to the sacramental sense in which human work and material creation itself, grapes, wine, wheat, bread, oil, water, wood, can indeed be revelatory of God. Moreover, it was a piece of land with a built-in community, with stories, with a history and a tradition, something literally passed down, traditio, from one hand and generation to the next, like the holy water at Mass from Charles Péguy's long poem, The Portal of the Mystery of Hope. And here I'll quote, as at the entrance of the church on Sunday and on the feast days, when we go to Mass or at the funerals, we give each other, we pass each other the holy water from hand to hand, from neighbor to neighbor, one after the other. So from hand to hand, from finger to finger, from fingertip to fingertip, the eternal generations who are eternally going to Mass, in the same breasts, in the same hearts, up to the death of the world, like a relay, in the same hope, the word of God is passed on, end quote. I came to realize belatedly that this manner of growing up with the aspirational vision and primal childhood hope that the world and everything in it was teeming with mystery, life, beauty, meaning, and possibility, made my later encounter with the notion of a sacramental worldview more a recognition of something I already knew, at least at a nonverbal bodily level. What if the world really were charged with the grandeur of God? This vision of the created world, wherein I could say with St. Basil of Caesarea that, quote, a single plant, a blade of grass, is sufficient to occupy all your intelligence in the contemplation of the skill which produced it, turned out to be possible and indeed made actual only with the Catholic point of view, which I would later adopt. But living in this predominantly Southern Protestant slice of the rural South, I never actually met a Catholic until I was in college. As a child, I only knew Catholics as shadowy, maybe even dangerous figures that everyone held in vague suspicion as a group without knowing any of them individually. My childhood was steeped in old-time Southern religion. For many years, my father was a Protestant minister in the Christian churches and Churches of Christ, which are relatively common in the South and in certain pockets of the Midwest. The emphasis in this movement was placed more on the oral than the visual, upon that which was sung, spoken, heard, preached, and proclaimed. My paternal grandfather was likewise a Protestant minister in those kinds of sparse, spare, simple roadside churches you're probably already picturing. The ones with old-fashioned piano music, nothing on the walls but a wooden rack to display the page numbers for the hymns, King James Bibles, a handful of good country people in the pews. That said, however, there was not any active anti-intellectualist nor fundamentalist strain that I can recall. Our house, at least, was overflowing with books, biblical concordances and commentaries with pull-out colored maps of ancient Jerusalem and Palestine, box sets of C.S. Lewis, a complete set of dark green Harvard classics, which lent us dignified, solid air to the living room, though I don't think I ever got past reading their impressive sounding spines. Plato, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, letters and treatises of Cicero and Pliny, Pilgrim's Progress, English Poetry 1, Chaucer to Gray. This tradition of Protestantism in which I was raised is situated in what is sometimes broadly called the Restoration Movement or the Stone Campbell Movement, which emerged in revivalist efforts in the United States during the 19th century to return to the unity of the first Christian church as described in the book of Acts. These churches are deeply congregationalist, which means that church congregations are autonomous and independent without formal ties to any wider denomination, ecclesiology, or overarching organizational structure. This movement values the Bible as the inspired word of God, the practice of baptism by immersion, the celebration of the Lord's Supper as a symbolic memorial, and such slogans as where the scriptures speak, we speak, where the scriptures are silent, we are silent. In essentials, unity, in opinions, liberty, in all things, love. And no creed but Christ, no book but the Bible, no law but love. When I was 11 or 12, my paternal grandfather got sick, and my father had to step into his place and take over the little church. My mother was and is a very talented church musician. At this time, she was the piano player at our regular church, but my grandfather's illness meant that our family had to go temporarily to 2 different churches. Since my grandfather's little church didn't have a piano player at that point, I was conscripted very, very reluctantly into taking the job. I'd only been taking piano lessons for a couple of years and only had about 4 songs in my repertoire. So every Sunday I plodded through Sweet Hour of Prayer, Amazing Grace, Come Thou Fount, Blessed Be the Tie That Binds. But the congregation was sweet and grateful. There was nothing slick or professional about our operation, but even that was a kind of grace. I think sometimes of Annie Dillard's essay, likening going to church, both Catholic and Protestant, to a dancing bear act in the circus. She writes that the set prayers and formulas of high church liturgies can seem sometimes as if people have forgotten the danger of addressing God directly. If God, she writes, quote, were to blast such a service to bits, the congregation would be, I believed, genuinely shocked. But in the low churches, you expect it any minute. This is the beginning of wisdom, end quote. So here I was, the daughter of the preacher and the young, decisively mediocre piano player of a little country church, feeling very deeply the peculiar burdens of holding the dancing bear act together. Becoming a Catholic was truly visceral relief from this sense of responsibility, however misplaced it might have been. Rather than the autonomous Congregationalist ecclesiology I knew from my formative years, the Catholic Church was big, international, sprawling, old. It had credentials. And it existed not only beyond me temporally and geographically, but also mystically. Later, this Catholic ecclesiology would captivate me entirely, not only viscerally, but also intellectually and spiritually. The perduring gift of growing up in this movement, though it is no longer a movement in which I identify myself, is a love for and deep familiarity with the scriptures. My students at Notre Dame sometimes think I'm some sort of wizard when I can rattle off long passages of scriptural text by heart. But these are the poetic musical rhythms of biblical speech that I internalized at my parents' knee and which are permanently imprinted in the most visceral sense of my embodied memory. I recently read Catholic poet Paul Claudel's magnificent little book simply titled J'aime la Bible, I love the Bible, which speaks of the associations of the scriptures with, quote, the first stirrings of my heart and imagination, and understands the Bible itself as a vast poem, an architectural drama, and a living city. He writes, quote, that the Holy Scriptures are more than a vehicle. They alone form a sublime edifice suited not only to worship, but to residence, and that the whole world was made for the sole purpose of serving them as support and embellishment. What house can compare with the scriptures, which are the temple of divine thought, and not only in beauty, but in what I call ultimate beauty, the substance of beauty, which is meaning, end quote. Growing up within this house or city of the scriptures made it such that when I began attending Catholic masses, as I was going through RCIA in 2004 and 2005, I found in an uncanny, bodily, remembered way that I was already at home in the language of the liturgical rites. What this movement failed to give me, however, was any awareness there was a long, complex tradition between the first century and my own. My spiritual formation was strongly animated by the narrative that there was something like a direct and even uncontroversial line between the primitive church of Acts 2:42, whose people devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers, and what it was we were all doing at West 8th Street Christian Church in Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina. Now, our friend St. John Henry Newman, we know, once famously remarked that to be deep in history is to cease to be a Protestant. For my own case, at least, this maxim proved itself true. I very distinctly remember, for example, reading St. Ignatius of Antioch's letter to the Smyrnians, which is dated about 110 AD, just a few short years after the last books of the New Testament were composed. I was staggered, absolutely staggered by the lines that read, "Let no man do anything connected with the church without the bishop. Let that be deemed a proper Eucharist, which is administered either by the bishop or by one to whom he has entrusted it. Wherever the bishop shall appear, there let the multitude of the people also be. Even as wherever Jesus Christ is, there is the Catholic Church." But that was all to come much later. So I'll turn finally to those deeply formative years of ages 18 to 24, the period of early adulthood during which I came to the startling, yet somehow also entirely foreordained decision that if I were to remain a Christian, it would have to be as a Roman Catholic. My undergraduate years were spent at a small Protestant college in the South, which was affiliated with the movement in which I had been raised. It was intellectually serious in its own way. There were mentors there, which I still count among my closest and most cherished friends. I came to discover during my time there, however, that I was entirely a stranger to the predominant forms of spiritual practice. Out of rhythm with the democratizing trends toward relevance and accessibility, sometimes to the degree that the content of the sermons I heard seemed almost indistinguishable from the broader culture of a pull yourself up by the bootstraps brand of self-improvement. Neither could I produce on cue the kinds of affective responses others seemed entirely comfortable producing. More than my constitutive introversion and intellectual bent, I also recall during this time a genuine sense of spiritual dryness, even something like abandonment, like the God who had been so present and intimate to me through my childhood, youth, was now far away and silent. Without knowing anything of the ancient tradition of praying with the Psalms, I began praying them, inscribing them in the pages of the journal I mentioned above. "Thou tellest my wanderings," I copied out from Psalm 56:8. "Put thou my tears into thy bottle, are they not in thy book?" And from Psalm 143, therefore is my spirit overwhelmed within me, my heart within me is desolate. These and other Psalms were a great consolation to me, giving voice within the pages of sacred scripture to the full range of human emotion, not just praise and thanksgiving, but also lament, fear, anxiety, anger, and sadness. Around the same time, I was introduced through a dear mutual friend, the man who would eventually become my husband. In his Confessions, Augustine says of Firminus, quote, your providence brought me a friend. In retrospect, I believe this providential interpretation likewise to be true of my friendship with Jay. Even if it has become somewhat hackneyed, C.S. Lewis's description of the blossoming of genuine friendship was and is a reliable account of the unfolding of our relationship. That is, when companions, quote, discover they have in common some insight or interest, or even taste which the others do not share, and which till that moment each believed to be his own unique treasure or burden. The typical expression of opening friendship would be something like, what? You too? I thought I was the only one. And instantly they stand together in an immense solitude. We talked about everything, mostly books, travel, religion. He had been a Catholic in his childhood years, receiving the sacraments at St. Anne's Catholic Church in the Diocese of Savannah, Georgia, though his parents had left the church when he was in middle school. In the summer of 2001, the night before I was to leave for a trip to Ethiopia with a Protestant mission, we decided together that we ought to get married, and then promptly set about 3 months of being half a world away from one another. Then I was off, headed to Kiramu, Ethiopia, via Amtrak from rural North Carolina, by way of the big city of Indianapolis, where our team training was to be held. Incredulously, the training for this decidedly Protestant mission was not set in the conference room of some ubiquitous chain hotel in the Midwest, as might be expected, but again providentially, in a Benedictine monastery called Our Lady of Grace Monastery in Beech Grove, Indiana, now just a few hours away from where I currently live in South Bend. I remember marveling at the austere little rooms with their white walls hung with crucifixes and Irish prayers, and at the rich statuary populating the Madonna Chapel. To me, at the time, it was all like something out of a movie set, wondrous and foreign, but nonetheless compelling in its own way. Could there really be, I remember thinking, such a thing as nuns? There were. That night, we had evening prayer with the Benedictine sisters, and I fell in love with the beauty and formality of it, with both the structure and the dynamism, the dialogical give and take of the antiphons, the sound of our voices praying together in common. And here too was the familiar language of the Psalms, which had become a veritable spiritual life raft for me, the thread that was still binding me to the faith. I was still 4 years away from finding the idea of becoming a Catholic, even a genuinely plausible one, but witnessing this new way of praying by these nuns reawakened my own prayer life at a time when I felt very much in the proverbial dark night of the soul. I'm reminded of that little line from Dorothy Day's Long Loneliness, where the then bohemian atheist Day recounts the shock and surprise of seeing her Catholic roommates praying. I saw them pray, Day wrote, and the public prayer of the church and Blanche's kneeling down by the table on which was spread out her hats and trimmings did something to me which I could not forget. The witnesses of the nuns likewise did something to me which I could not forget. It was nothing less than the expansion of my imagination regarding what in fact was and was not possible in terms of spiritual practices and forms of life. Journal entries for the next few years witnessed to this enlargement of spiritual imagination. In my archival research, meant to prevent tonight's exercise from being merely what Newman called a product of the imagination, I found pages peppered with quotes from the likes of Julian of Norwich, Basil of Caesarea, Origen, St. Catherine of Siena, Hildegard von Bingen, George Bernanos, St. Augustine, Flannery O'Connor, Thomas Merton's Seven-Story Mountain, the prayers of St. Francis, lines from the Glory Be and the Te Deum, and the prayers of the Desert Fathers. I went to an Ash Wednesday service to receive ashes and was appropriately moved and devastated by the priest's words, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." All of this was a revelation, though at the time I loved these works only intellectually, as a curious outsider looking in, as when Dorothy Day read the French novels of Huysmans and wrote that, quote, "It was these books which made me feel that I too could be at home in the Catholic Church without becoming a Catholic." end quote. In May of 2002, Jay and I were married. And in June of 2003, I wrote, still, I feel a consistent draw toward the Catholic faith. Jacques Maritain, Etienne Gilson, Thomas Merton, Dorothy Day, Walker Percy, my own husband, end quote. A few months later, I drove out alone to the Trappist Monastery of the Holy Spirit in Conyers, Georgia, which was founded in 1944 by 20 monks from the Abbey of Gethsemane near Bardstown, Kentucky, where Thomas Merton had lived and prayed. Flannery O'Connor's peacocks, or at least their peacock children or grandchildren, I don't know how long peacocks live, roamed the grounds of the Monastery of the Holy Spirit. It really is a stunning place, made more stunning perhaps by the hazy light of my recollections. But I do remember quite clearly how the grounds hummed with a quiet, insistent life. Not just the peacocks fanning out their glorious trains full of eyes like so many apocalyptic angels, but also bees nuzzling clover and bright peonies, birds perched along the steeple of the Abbey Church, the thrum of cicadas and geese. In my retrospections, coming to understand the ethos of Catholicism and to come to place myself within it was very much mirroring the formative experiences of my childhood, intimately tied with the sensuality and the beauty of place. Every blade of grass, as Dostoevsky puts it, every insect, ant, and golden bee bear witness to the mystery of God and continually accomplish it themselves. All creation and all creatures, every leaf is striving to the word, singing glory to God, weeping to Christ, unconsciously accomplishing this by the mystery of their sinless life, end quote. During this initial visit to the monastery, I recall looking at the stained glass rose window in the Abbey Church and feeling, however tentatively, as if I could be at home within the Catholic tradition. My heart, I wrote, ever since I drove onto the monastery property, has not ceased to beat at almost twice the normal speed. There is no part of life that is not holy. But this realization was something of a slow burn. Somehow it took over a year for me to return to the monastery. But when I went back in September of 2004 for a 3-day retreat on contemplative prayer, at last my restlessness began to fade. The abbot, Dom Francis Michael, led the retreat, but the most unforgettable conversation I had was in a session of spiritual counsel with a delightfully spirited monk called Father Tom Francis, whose eyes, despite his age, glowed with the fire of a kind of eternal youth. We talked at length about Catholic theology and history, the saints, even about Hans Urs von Balthasar's book on prayer. He confided in me somewhat mirthfully his own contemplative prayer practice of imagining himself riding joyfully and laughing riotously like a young child on the back of Aslan from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. After about 30 minutes of this, when I finally disclosed to him that I was actually a Protestant, maybe thinking about maybe becoming a Catholic, he was flabbergasted. "What are you waiting for?" he said. I didn't have a good answer. So when I returned home from the retreat, I cold called the Basilica of the Sacred Heart of Jesus in downtown Atlanta, the first Roman Catholic basilica in Georgia, established in 1880, and began RCIA alongside my husband and his brother. Again, the felt experience of that entire process was more like a homecoming than not. One journal entry from that time read, "It finally feels like I am putting on my own skin after a long hiatus without being in my proper element." In March of 2005, 3 weeks before I was finally to be confirmed as a Catholic, I got the good news that I had been accepted into the Master of Theological Studies at the University of Notre Dame, a place I've called home for the last 17 years, first as a graduate student, and now as a faculty member of the Program of Liberal Studies and the Department of Theology. As I said at the outset, most of my work in academic theology is centered around the thought of Hans Urs von Balthasar, whose project is animated by the coincidence of the beautiful with the good and the true. I became a Catholic very simply because I believed Catholicism to be beautiful and good and true. Balthasar's metaphysics stipulates furthermore that being itself is full of future, full of possibility. It is, quote, essentially open-ended. Even more, it is essentially a beginning, a promise, a hope, an upspringing, end quote. His ecclesiology likewise stipulates that the Catholic Church in her being has a future. Quote, the more it is thought about and lived, especially by those whom one calls saints, the more inexhaustible, and hence the more belonging to the future does it rise before the eyes of the faithful, end quote. To be a Catholic, then, is to be increasingly intimate to the ever-expanding borders of the possible. The lived practice of the Catholic faith, from hand to hand, from finger to finger, from fingertip to fingertip, the eternal generations who are eternally going to Mass, bodies the tradition forward and gathers up with it those who glimpse themselves already in it. I became a Catholic because I could no longer see my own future as something that was not placed within this community and this horizon of possibility from glory to glory, because I could not longer envision a future that was anything but inexhaustible, as an inexhaustible promise and vision. I'm a Catholic because I want truly to be and to see. So thank you for your kind attention. I look forward to having our conversation in the Q&A. Over to you, Michael Murphy.
Hello, I'm here. I'm just clapping here on behalf of all of our Zoom community. A wonderful talk coming through, and there's lots of questions. I have some that I received earlier, and I have a lot coming through the chat, and then I have a couple of people I want to unmute. I think I'll just kind of start. It's so wonderful to hear about these kind of monastic moments. There's so many pieces of this talk I was writing pretty furiously about, but I was thinking about Father Tom Francis and that kind of person whose eyes glow with the fire of eternal youth. Very fortunate to have met some of those people. And so I think those are critical areas when you're in this space, almost like a womb-like setting, to a liminal space to go from one place to another. So that's an observation, but I'll ask you one question, then I'll open it up to everybody else. Thinking about Hans Urs von Balthasar and the Transcendentals, but the idea of being open-ended, and I wonder too about his Jesuit years and the formation of his imagination. And I'll say more, that the spirit is always ever open. Balthasar has something in Theologic where he says that the spirit is empowered to utter a fresh and central answer to every situation. And there's something it might surprise people to think Balthasar is kind of stodgy and closed. It's just the opposite. And so I think there's something, because in Jesuit discernment, someone like Pope Francis, like the Philadelphia story, the best time to make up your mind about somebody is never, right? So when you're discerning something, like Pope Francis is doing me with synodality, is like saying, we're not closed. We're open to what the Spirit has to tell us. Can you speak more about that kind of way of greeting your faith?
Thank you. That's a really thoughtful question. And, obviously this is one of the things that I love about Balthasar's own writing, all his little essays. He's got one called but the Spirit and the Improvisation of Future, which is very much like that. I mean, I think you're exactly right to point to his Jesuit formation of, sort of seeing what will happen. And it's sort of, he talks also of being itself as having a kind of chalice-like character, right? It's always kind of living outside of itself, ecstatically, like welcoming everything. And so when he's talking about like everything that exists, he says that nothing is ever kind of finished giving itself, right? A tiny gnat and a pebble, it's always kind of just brimming with being and sort of oriented to. So, I mean, I think his metaphysics is kind of connected with this, but it's also, I mean, to bring it kind of down to earth. I like very much what you're saying about the wait and see kind of thing, right? I mean, so I think you're right that many people sometimes understand Balthasar as a kind of a dogmatist who sort of has decided this is the way it is. But to me, I think in my own kind of like practice of Catholicism and my own placement in terms of the kind of Catholic political landscape, right? I find that it's very difficult to sort of situate myself. I find that it's always best to listen, to wait, to hear a little more. And so I think that that's something that's always attracted me about Balthasar and about Catholicism in general, right? That there is a kind of plurality and a sort of generosity about all of the Catholics kind of in this big tent, and being sympathetic to and understanding of one another. I mean, that's the goal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you. That's lovely. We have a student, and I'm going to unmute her, Ava Jennings. Ava, do you have a question or comment for Dr. Martin?
Oh,
Ava.
give me 1 second. Sometimes my microphone acts up. Can you hear me all right?
No problem, Ava. You sound great.
All right, great. I don't really know what to say, but I guess I was wondering how your career has continued to influence your personal decision or vice versa. Like, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's really a thoughtful question. So as Michael said in the introduction, I'm sort of placed within two departments at Notre Dame, the Department of Theology and the Program of Liberal Studies. And the work that I do in the Program of Liberal Studies, which is mostly pedagogical, right? I don't get a lot of publications about the kinds of books that we're reading there, but I mean, to me, that feels like some of the most important and kind of most Catholic work, right? Catholic in terms of thinking about Catholicity and the plurality of kind of voices and the way of kind of like hearing and listening sympathetically, like what Michael was just saying. I think something like almost magical happens when we're in these seminar rooms and we're talking about the Brothers Karamazov or whatever book it might be, and people are kind of expressing themselves in these ways, or like even pointed critiques, right? I mean, there's a way in which I think this kind of teaching, the outcome of this kind of education is very integrative, and it also kind of forms good citizens of the world, right, who are able to kind of listen and speak. But in terms of my own sort of research and publications, in terms of career, I'm very fortunate to be placed at a place like Notre Dame, where the theology department is very they're very serious when they say that theology is faith seeking understanding, right? So those faith commitments are not something that are a benefit to me. It's a real joy, I think, to teach classes for people who don't know the Catholic faith, and to try to do what Balthasar wanted to do, which was make it compelling aesthetically, to make it beautiful, to make it compelling in terms of the beauty of its argumentation, right? So the beautiful and the true and the good are all kind of together. So yeah, I think very much it's kind of connected to, I mean, had I not become a Catholic, I think I would certainly be in a different place, and I wouldn't have the kind of like teaching life and writing life that I do now. So thank you, Ava, for that question.
Yeah, I echo my thank you to Ava as well. Wonderful. Here's one that was sent in, Jenny. It's from Donna Pineda. And Donna writes, what surprised you most about coming to know and embrace the Catholic faith? What's one gem you could share with us?
Well, I'm going to take those as two separate questions, because I was surprised actually when I give this kind of account of becoming a Protestant, being a Protestant who became a Catholic, and then 2 months later I go to Notre Dame, where I sort of have this very idealistic kind of picture of what, or very, I guess, homogenous picture of Catholicism. And then it took me a while, I think, once I was in a predominantly Catholic place, to sort of understand the landscape of American Catholicism. It took me several years, I think, to sort of figure out what that was. And so that was a surprise to me, that so many Catholics could be in a room and disagree with each other. But it's been actually really wonderful, because I guess the gem is that it's this sort of sense of Catholicity, right? Where there's the sense that Catholicity is not the same thing as saying homogeneity. Catholicity is actually protective of this kind of plural vision of what it means to be a Catholic, and what it means to sort of navigate your way through the world as a Catholic. And I mean, I think that was a real kind of gift to me, that you could sort of affirm, you affirm the basic kind of tenets of the faith, you affirm the creed. Our liturgy holds us together. And then there are kind of places where we have conversation. And yeah, I think that is the sort of the fact that Catholicism somehow manages to be unified and yet have so many different expressions, and not just in American Catholicism, of course, but all over, in so many countries, people are celebrating the Mass. That's a very sort of a beautiful thing to me. I think, like I said, it was ecclesiology in a way. It was liturgy that made me fall in love with it. So this kind of both unity and diversity, which the Catholic Church is able to kind of pull together.
Yeah, you think of the dual line. Is it Augustine? I think it might be attributed to him. It might not be him though. But unity in essentials and diversity in non-essentials. That kind of porousness. That's good. And then to bring it back to the Jesuit context again, you always hear the old line: whenever there are 3 Jesuits, there are 4 opinions. Something like that.
I love it.
Let me stick with some kind of maybe professional life and related, where we have Ron Nasser who asks about Newman. So let's put our Newman hat on. How did Newman's conversion impact his educational philosophy outlined in The Scope and Nature of University Education, a famous work? And then Ron follows up saying that he thinks Alistair McIntyre makes the same kind of move. How do you think about that?
Well, of course, I'm not a Newman scholar, so I think there are probably Newman scholars among us who could probably do a better job with that question. But I mean, I can't help but think that the idea of a university, which was after the conversion, right? So Newman converted in 1845, and then idea of a university, I think, came out in 1852. And in that book, sort of the vision of that book is a kind of integrated understanding of education, and the fact that it has to include theology as a kind of like central node around which the other disciplines can function, right? Because if we exclude theology a priori as a discipline, then are we really is there really a universal kind of university education? And so, I think as someone who kind of thinks about Catholic education, both kind of in my day-to-day work and also kind of in the abstract, I would surmise that there is a real sense in which the sort of Catholic vision of how things are mutually informative in terms of educational philosophy, that there's something like really important there. I mean, I know in the book too, he talks about a good university might also be just getting a lot of really smart people together and have them have a conversation, right? You can dispense with the other things. And so it's that kind of like relationships are kind of the most kind of important, which is something that, I think I really care about in terms of education, at least in the great books department that I'm in, right? That it's those relationships that kind of start first. But yeah, I mean, I would imagine so, but I would defer to real Newman scholars for a real answer to that question. There was another question actually in the chat on Newman. I think it was a personal question from John Grappi. Is it all right if I?
Yeah, please. I love that. Go ahead.
Perfect. So he says in the chat, you called the Apologia a memoir. Newman called it an apologia, a defense of reputation, as he had been accused of being a liar. Please comment. So actually, when I was talking about Newman's preface, that was to his autobiographical memoir. And he was, he's talking about just memoirs in general and lives in general. And so I think it is, important to say a little bit about the unique character of the Apologia itself, right? Because it's not just a kind of piece of autobiographical writing. It's not like the Confessions insofar as in a way it is, but it has such an edge because his entire reputation has been called into question, right? Not just that he's disingenuous, that he's, that his conversion is somehow, that he's a dishonest person, right? So it calls his whole kind of personality and character into question, right? So this is not just a sort of autobiographical writing without any teeth. I think Cyril O'Regan actually has a really nice essay on this question where he talks about, sometimes students read the Confessions. I mean, I'm reading Confessions with my theology students right now, and it's a beautiful book. It's so compelling. And then you read Apologia and you're like, this is really dry. And Cyril says he's deploying this style of forensic rhetoric on purpose to show, because if he was too stylish, then all of his critics who thought he was disingenuous and a liar would be like, see, I told you, you're trying to get something over on us by your fancy words, right? So that kind of deliberate deployment of rhetoric in the apologia. So I think it's a great question, and I was glad to see it.
Yeah, same here. And I think that's an astute observation, because Newman writes in many registers. He's even written a novel. So, but you really got to be rhetorically precise. So thank you for that, everybody. I want to unmute now. I just lost him. Where'd he go? I'll find him. Or Patty, if you're there, can you unmute Paul Contino? I got him. Paul. Yeah, Paul. This is. Hey, Paul, how are you? Yeah,
I'm good, Mike. And hello, Jenny. It's
Hi,
nice
Paul.
to be unmuted. If you want to look at me, well, you better not. I didn't iron my shirt. If you want to, all right, there I am. No, I'm not there. Okay, Jenny, here's the thing. I love your book so much, and I just wanted to put a shout out to everybody listening. This book on Balthasar and Russian thought is so wise, so integrative. Rereading it today, I actually wrote down a quote. I'll only read part of it. The precise image of wholeness is the wounded Christ, the lamb slain from the foundations of the world. And thus, the theologian or the believer is called to a kind of renunciation of the possibility of seeing the whole. This, for Balthasar, is paradoxically a practice of wholeness, since God is nowhere nearer than in the humility and poverty of indifference, and the openness to death, and the renunciation of every hold on or attempt to make certain of God. I just want to tell you, I love that. And I also love your conclusion, in which you acknowledge throughout that Balthasar is speculative, and then in the conclusion, delineate ways in which licit and salutary speculative theology can take place. There was a prelude to a question. The fourth criteria is, of course, generosity toward the ambiguous cultural contributions of the world. Music, art, drama, prose literature, poetry. You mentioned the standbys, Peggy, Claudel, O'Connor, Percy. Have there been surprising, culturally formative, or examples of culture, and I think here especially of images? I teach at Pepperdine, which is a Church of Christ school. I understand the tradition from which you come, perhaps images, be it in painting, in film, music, even popular music or popular film, in that either was formative in toward a Catholic vision of the whole, or perhaps now you see it in a way that you might not have before.
Wow, what a wonderful question. Thank you, Paul. That's really something to think about. So beyond the usual suspects, I might sort of first play a kind of nostalgia card, because I've been doing that all night, but and think back a little to the kinds of sort of like music that I grew up with, which was not particularly Catholic or religious, but the sort of like strains of kind of like Appalachian folk and bluegrass, and then this sort of being part of this kind of community of people. Like I remember sort of standing around, everyone's playing the mandolin and the dobro and the banjo, and we're singing these songs together, and like, okay, so this gives me a foretaste. I mean, I really do think of of genuine community, right, where everyone is kind of working together to create something really beautiful. So that would be my kind of nostalgic answer to the question. Super kind of like low art, right? So not something really highbrow. And then I think, as you were talking a bit about the first quote that you read out as well, about sort of renunciating the claim to be able to see everything at once, right? So sometimes Balthasar gets criticized by presuming a God's eye view or a bird's eye view, and trying to do too much or to say too much about kind of the inner life of the Trinity or whatever it might be. But I think his work is actually more marked by that kind of renunciation. And so he says, he's kind of the theologian of form, right? We think about Balthasar as a kind of like connected with form and classical form, but I think about what he says, that beauty can manifest itself even in the formlessness, even in the void, right? We see like the beauty is the crucified Christ, right? So on the one hand, we might not think of kind of profound radical suffering as something that can be beautiful, the face of the crucified Christ. But when he talks about sometimes beauty blows where it will, like the Spirit, right? It's sometimes it's in form, sometimes it's in formlessness, in the dynamism of line, this kind of thing. And I think my kind of maybe non-usual suspect would be how surprisingly moved I was and am in recent years with non-figural, with abstract art, with stuff like Jackson Pollock, right? I used to think that stuff was a talentless kind of. My husband always makes fun of me because when we first met, I mocked Jackson Pollock sort of like very sort of vigorously, but now I think there's something about this kind of spirit of sort of dynamism and beauty in kind of those contingent moments. Someone like a Helen Frankenthaler, right? Or her painting Canyon is one that I look at and I find absolutely inexhaustible, right? There's nothing Catholic about it. There's nothing figural about it, but there's something that knocks on the door of my heart every time I see that painting that makes me kind of more assured that that beauty sort of blows where it will, it's not something we can control. And that's certainly what Balthasar will say, being kind of constitutively open to the unexpected.
I wonder if, I don't know, Adam or Patty, if you can, what's the name of the painting? I don't know that one, Jenny.
It's Frankenthaler's Canyon is what it's called.
Adam, can you find Frankenthaler's Canyon? Maybe we can put it on the screen for people in a couple of minutes. Just take a quick look at that. But in the meantime, I want to pick it up, Jenny, on nostalgia. So this, as you were speaking about nostalgia, I kind of sat up in my chair. So you felt somehow a sense of coming home in your conversion. There was something, the kind of the rhythm of the liturgy, a theological naturalism, an openness to the saturation of sacramentality that really spoke to your heart and your being. But you said nostalgia, and I'm noticing a lot around theological wonky people in my conversations that people are very critical of nostalgia these days, and they favor something like radical alterity, radical newness. But I'm not ready to give up on nostalgia, and I don't, not because I want to go back to living in some type of crazy made up romantic age, but there's something of the Greek notion, right, of nostos, of homecoming, that is very compelling. How do you think about that?
Well, I mean, my first book, it's sort of rode on the coattails of the claim that Balthasar is not a nostalgic theologian. So on the one hand, it's saying I was sort of like writing, I think, against the grain of reading Balthasar as a kind of like a retrograde sort of conservative who doesn't care about newness. So, I think I'm also kind of compelled, I do a lot of work on Charles Péguy. And of course, my friends from the Catholic Worker who are here will sort of recognize this as well, that there's something, this notion of radicality and root are very much connected, right? So this idea that for Charles Péguy, what it is to do something new, what it is to sort of have a revolution is to go back to the more ancient well springs, right? I mean, so there's a sense in which I feel like there are two, like the binaries which have been kind of ossified. Okay, there's a kind of conservatism and there's a kind of progressivism. There's a sort of looking forward, aggiornamento and ressourcement, right? That these two things have become binaries and you have to kind of pick one or the other. But I think the way that Péguy, at least, and Balthasar think about these things, the way I think of them is, like if you want something new, there's the newness is already there, right? I mean, like that's what I kind of wanted is trying to say here. I think with the talk is we don't have to invent novelty. That we have a God who is, if Tom Francis's eyes glowed with the fire of eternal youth, we have a God who is himself, connected with eternal use with behold, I shall make all things new, right, from Revelation, right? I mean, you have this sense in which you don't have to bring novelty to the Catholic Church because it's brimming with it, right? I mean, it's as long as there are saints, as long as there are people passing the holy water from hand to hand and fingertip to fingertip, we're living it. And, you know, the Spirit is directing the church. And so yeah, I mean, I think just kind of like burning it down and starting over, that is a really impoverished understanding of what novelty is and can do. Thank you for that question.
And thank you for that answer. That was beautiful. Let's, speaking of something newer, well, whatever that might mean, let's take a look at this painting. And
I'll put it in the chat, yeah.
yeah, so tell us something. We don't want anatomy of art, but like what moves you in this?
I think, I mean, it's really hard to explain, actually. I think there's something that happens with the dynamism of the eye, right? You start at the top left and you can't stop your eye from kind of going down that curve. The wash of the color, you know, like this is something that like my sort of aesthetic, when I was sort of young and dogmatic, right? I would have thought this is something that could be beautiful, but I don't know why. I just feel like there's something, in any kind of abstract art, and especially this one, it makes you stop and attend, right? I mean, I've often think about this in modern art as well. Like, if we can kind of think about this category of mystery and inexhaustible mystery and the ways in which things are brimming with mystery, people that we sit beside on the subway are brimming with mystery, like, and we like walk past them and think we know what they are when we see it. You know, this is this sort of person, so we can dismiss that and we can move on. But I think what abstract art does, what this painting might do, is it discloses its mystery to us in a gradual way, and I think we ought to look at not just art, but everybody, you know, with that same sort of sense of expectation that you will be disclosing to me a mystery. I don't know, that's a kind of a sermonizing read of it, but
I don't know, because there's something about attention, you know, is it Simone Weil, what's the French, I don't, l'attente,
right,
yeah. You know, that's what I think we're talking about here is paying attention, you know, and you were paying attention in your journey, and you still are. I mean, now you make it's your life's work to pay attention and help others learn how to do that. So I think that's great. I think we got time for two more. You know, thanks everybody for your questions. And I'd like to unmute folks, but you know, sometimes you're not sure what's going to happen. But I think we're moving toward that. Maybe it's my. I should pray for faith, Jenny.
You're open to what may come, right? You know, we'll see.
Yeah. But here's one from Father John Schultz. He's a two-parter, but you know, I think you outlined the first part. He says, "What is your primary reason for becoming Catholic?" But I like his other one. He says, "If you had 3 minutes with Pope Francis, what would you say to him?"
I actually met Pope Francis, which I didn't get to talk to him very much, but Jay won a prize with the Institute for Church Life in their science and religion thing, and we got to go and
Expanded Reason Award. Congratulations, Jay Martin.
Yes, I know, exactly, bravo. But we got to talk with him briefly, and I mean, all he said to me was, "Pray for me," and I said the same thing back to him. But if I had 3 minutes instead of 42 seconds, I think I might ask how he sort of understands his own papacy relative to Ratzinger and maybe even John Paul II, right? I mean, because there's often, you know, there's sort of tonal differences, I guess, or stylistic differences between the two. But I wonder how he would place himself relative to his predecessors, especially someone like Ratzinger, who's still alive. You know, how he would kind of understand both the continuities and the differences in terms of style, tone, and content. And I'd also, I think, want to know what he thinks. I find his style very kind of refreshing and compelling in a lot of ways. I would sort of ask if he has any kind of practical thoughts about how, because he seems like a very practical sort of person, right? Practical thoughts about how to make the faith kind of really compelling to people. You know, sometimes I sort of bemoan the sort of fact that people are sort of, or young people especially, are leaving the church in droves, and I wonder what he would say And I'd also maybe ask if I had 4 minutes. He gave me a bit of an existential crisis with Laudato Si. Like you can't do anything without ruining something else, right? I mean, it's all connected. I would want to talk, I think, about some kind of environmental kinds of questions and best practices, I suppose.
Yeah, that's good. On that line of like disaffiliation from Gen's, I guess Gen Y, millennials, and Z. There's something about big institutions failing young people for, it happens a lot, but it happened quite acutely last 20 years. But there's a question about that from Betty Brown in a pre-question. I think she's on to what you're on to, Jenny. And I often find our way, she says, of communicating unconvincing, unempathetic, too conventional to reach a broader audience. Suggestions?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know, like if we go all the way down to sort of the parish level, I kind of wonder, can we do more to kind of open these mysteries of the sacraments to people and to families in ways that make them feel that, so we can feel the weight of the mystery and feel the sort of beauty of the thing, right? I mean, sometimes I think, in terms of the sacraments of initiation, we present these things as very sort of matter of fact. Like, okay, so this is what you do. This is how you do it. This is the kind of, you're going to be confirmed because you're in the 8th grade and we're going to check the box and that's that. But I mean, is there a way of kind of communicating the let's see, not just the mystery, but the numinousness of what it is we're all doing here, right? I mean, this is actually like a tremendous miracle that this is even a thing, right? I mean, that we're able to, have the body and blood of the Lord, or that our baptism seal, orient us, and our confirmation sealed us. Like, can we think about these sort of ways in which the sacraments were related in these kind of like more sort of artful ways? I sometimes think we should make religious education not easier and more accessible, but harder and more textured. Just as a way of kind of showing that there's inherent beauty here. This isn't just like any other kind of institutional organization. This is something like really mysterious that we're doing here together.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We'll do one more. Okay, this probably it's, I think, appropriate, from Luke Stringfellow.
Oh, Luke. Hi, Luke.
Oh, good. You know Luke. Good.
Yeah.
Could you speak more about how you saw and still see the role of grace in your life? If conversion is an act of the will, that's a question, and this must always be preceded by grace, I am curious how you theorize abstractly about theology of grace and how it has been manifested in your life. It's a very Newman question, Luke, but what do you think, Jenny?
Well, I'm not a Thomist, and I'm not going to start saying, well, there are, X number of kinds of grace, and this is this and this is that. But I think I'm actually compelled, I think, by the way that someone like Rahner thinks about grace, where he talks first about a kind of uncreated grace, which is sort of the Trinity reaching out to us all the time in love, right? I mean, so there's this kind of like envelope of grace, always with the offer of grace. And it's something that we kind of dwell in, as a sort of envelope of our existence. So I like that idea very much. But, the question with Rahner theologians have, and I have too, is, if everything is grace, then is nothing grace, so like if we're all just kind of living and moving and being in this, I do feel that, we experience a particular grace in the sacraments, of course, those sort of efficacious graces that can't be replicated elsewhere. But I don't know, I think I'm sort of prone to the, what's the end of the novel of the Diary of a Country Priest, right? I'm prone to that conclusion, which
all
might be too much. All is grace, everything is grace, it's all grace. It sounds like I just sort of, that's the way I think I see the world, in this kind of more pervasive sense of God is always kind of working in these hidden ways. And we just need kind of eyes to see and to discern it.
Yeah, I'm going to pull director's privilege here and ask you to read a poem because of how you feel. I just pulled it up. So are you ready to go? It's a Levertov. Primary one.
Want me to read it?
Yeah, you can do this. Would you mind?
I would love to. There we go. So Denise Levertov, Primary Wonder. Days pass when I forget the mystery. Problems insoluble and problems offering their own ignored solutions jostle for my attention. They crowd its antechamber along with a host of diversions, my courtiers, wearing their colored clothes, caps, and bells. And then, once more, the quiet mystery is present to me. The throng's clamor recedes. The mystery that there is anything at all, let alone cosmos, joy, memory, everything rather than void. And that, O Lord, Creator, hallowed one, you still, hour by hour, sustain it. Oh, that's beautiful.
Oh, good. I got you.
Got me. That was perfect.
Everybody, that's Denise Levertov who got Jenny. But hey, can we put our hands together spiritually for Dr. Jennifer Newsome Martin? What a lovely talk, and thanks very much. So I want to say thank you and good night to all. Thanks again to Jenny, and to go easy and to take care of each other and to step by step as we keep moving through these strange days. Hope to see you at the Pope event next week, and good night, one and all. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Michael.
You're welcome.